Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nick Knowles. Welcome to the behind the scenes look at our lab. This is all our experimental testing equipment. Here's what we call an electrodynamic testing frame. What this allows us to do is very accurately simulate different loads and conditions that our joint tissues experience. Right now we have it set up with a surrogate to simulate something like a tendon or a ligament material property. And so what this system can do is either pull in tension or push in compression, or it can twist. And then we can do different profiles on our computer, which allow us to simulate different conditions. So we could do full gait in upper extremity, or we can simulate lower extremity conditions if we're doing studies in different joints. The information from this computer can be directly implemented into our computational models that we collect image-based data, and then we use this experimental data for validation of those computational models. Similarly, when we want to look at larger joints or joint replacements, or in this case, a simulated shoulder blade for whole bone fracture, this machine allows us to very accurately test the forces and displacements that a bone will experience, and then we can measure things like the bone's strength. This camera system allows us to very accurately determine things like displacements, and then again, we can capture everything in real time on our computer system. And so if we see here, under a compressive loading test, we can see what will happen when this 3D printed bone model that's been reconstructed from a cadaver shoulder blade experiences compressive loading. Because we are controlling all the factors on a machine like this, we're able to very accurately replicate these scenarios in our computational models, which allow us to introduce different factors that could be patient-specific, material-specific, or disease-specific, which is really important in our lab as we start to look at things like how do tissue, specifically bone material properties, change with disease progressions such as osteoarthritis. This is our bioreactor system. Where it really starts is when patients end up having total joint replacement or total shoulder replacement specifically. So these are 3D printed models of the proximal humerus, so the bone in our upper arm. And what happens in osteoarthritis is the articular surface of the humeral head becomes diseased. And so in surgery, this section of the bone is completely removed. It looks different, obviously, based off of different patient anatomy. These have all been three-dimensionally reconstructed from CT data, and these have been 3D printed. What we're able to do specifically with this setup is take diseased bone from patients who are undergoing joint arthroplasty procedures. Typically, this bone would be thrown out with medical waste, but we collect it and repurpose it in the lab. And we've developed this bioreactor system, which allows us to keep the bone samples alive for up to 28 days. What we're able to do in that case is apply different mechanical loads on some of the equipment that I've just shown you. It circulates the cell culture medium through a pump such as this system, and then this entire system would go in an incubator, which simulates the conditions that we see within the human body. We're then able to test different factors, biochemical factors within the test tubes that circulate the medium. And then we're able to apply different mechanical loads. And then as we micro-CT and do other imaging parameters across time, we're able to determine how the bone actually adapts to things like mechanical changes or other things that we integrate into our system. This is really a controlled process, and it allows us to integrate something like bone adaptation into computational models, which is very seldom done up until this point. The really overarching goal from this, which is really driven by donor-funded research, is that we can now develop patient-specific or personalized models specific to each condition. And so it's really a groundbreaking mechanism that I'm really excited to talk to you more about in the future. Hey guys, we're here at our care facility. This is one of the rooms where we're able to capture motion capture and ultrasound on some of our participants on our arthritis-related studies. Later today, we'll see how we use some of this data in our computational models and experimental testing from our other lab spaces. Here you can see ultrasound being collected on the shoulder, which allows us to generate images which can be used for analysis and for computational modeling. These cameras allow us to track exactly where the upper arm is in space, and in this case, relative to the ultrasound probe. And so this allows us to very accurately experimentally measure what we call the kinematics or motion, as well as develop our computational models and do our mathematical calculations to make sure that we're collecting the same type of data across participants. Now we're going to check out our bone and body composition lab here at the care facility. This is where we're able to collect some of our imaging data that we then use in our computational models, and we can do participant studies across different time points or within cross-sectional studies. Theo has volunteered to set us up to show how we would do a typical forearm scan on our DEXA scanner. This is the typical bone mineral density machine that we would see in a hospital setting. Here we have it strictly for research use. What a DEXA machine has is an X-ray and detector in the top and bottom, and what this allows us to do is collect very accurate bone density and body composition measurements. So using very standardized regions of interest, similar to how Theo has his hand set up here, we're able to capture bone mineral density, bone mineral content, and bone area measures in specific regions in the forearm. If we were to lay on the bed completely, then we could get a full body composition measurement, which would give us estimates of bone mineral density, bone mineral content, fat mass, and lean mass. And so we can track those over time as biomarkers of disease progression. And we're starting to explore different methods to be able to use technology such as DEXA for osteoarthritis research. Although typically DEXA is used for osteoporosis research right now and is very standardized to the hip, lower spine, and forearm. We're exploring other methods that we can use DEXA and similar imaging technologies for shoulder osteoarthritis. Okay, now we're going to check out the biomechanics labs in kinesiology and health sciences. Hey guys, welcome to the TMMI Imaging and Visualization Lab. And this is where our research happens. And now we're going to look at some of the work that Theo's doing. What we're looking at on this screen here are some micro CT images taken from the proximal humerus, or the bone in our upper arm. What we're able to see in these different images are the outer cortical bone, shown in purple here, and the inner trabecular bone. And these are the different sections of bone that are typically affected in osteoarthritis. And so we can do different mechanical tests and build different computational models built off of micro CT data, similar to what we're looking at on the screen. What's nice with three-dimensional micro CT data as well is we can visualize our bones in 3 dimensions. And so these are trabecular bone cores taken from patients who have undergone joint replacement. And what we're able to see is how the microstructure changes with respect to time and with respect to disease processes. So we can analyze these using different computational techniques, and we can build these into computational models so that we can link the image data directly to bone mechanics, and we can compare these across different populations. What we have here is what we call a bioreactor system. So those small cores that we were just looking at in the 3-dimensional micro CT data, we can test the physical bone cores in a system like this. It allows us to test things like bone adaptation and look at how that internal microarchitecture of bone is changing with respect to time. Okay, now we're going to check out some of the work that Mary's working on. So what we have on these screens are pretty consistent with the clinical CT imaging data that we have. This one specifically is one of our cadaver specimens. And what we have under our specimen here in the CT image is what we call a calibration phantom. And so this allows us to accurately measure what we call volumetric bone mineral density as one of the predictive measures of bone changes over time. What's nice, again, with this 3-dimensional image data is that we can create 3-dimensional reconstructions of anatomy. In this case, we can see in the lighter blue a representation of the scapula. And what it allows us to do is look at things like the joint contact and orientation of the bones relative to each other. So in the brighter blue here is a representation of our humerus. And then we can link those back to the bone mineral density parameters that we have on the screen. And we can look at different regional differences of how the bone mineral density is changing in specific locations. We can use these to build computational models. And we can simulate things like joint replacement or other surgical procedures, or we can use them just to look at how the morphology or the bone shape changes over time, or how things like density change over time. Great, now we're going to look at some of the work that Massa, one of the postdocs, has been working on. So we have, moving on the screen here, is a situation that we often encounter when patients end up with what we call acromial fractures or shoulder blade fractures following reverse shoulder arthroplasty. And so what this model is showing is the displacement of the acromion under very specific loading situations and hopefully be able to predict when fractures occur in different patients. If we want to integrate things like the microarchitecture or the underlying bone, we can look at samples similar to what we have on the left screen here, where we're looking at an osteoarthritic bone and the trabecular architecture that goes through the bone. And so our black spaces here represent marrow, and the red and orange spaces represent what we call the trabeculae. And so this underlying architecture changes as a function of disease processes with bone resorption or formation in different locations. And then we can use these models to build micro-finite element models, which allow us to simulate the underlying mechanics of the bone. We can use these as biomarkers of osteoarthritic progression or normal bone, and how the architecture and how the underlying distributions of mechanical properties change as a function of time. Now we'll look at some of the work that Johannes is working on. So what we have on this screen is another representation of our proximal humerus, cortical bone, and trabecular bone. So what Johannes is able to do here is scroll through different slices or different volume thicknesses. And what it allows us to accurately do is look at how thick the cortical shell is. This changes as a function of disease process. What we have here is the trabecular bone, and so we can see how that architecture or how that microstructure changes as a function of position. What we have on the other screen here is what we call a musculoskeletal model. So a very simplified model here allows us to look at a discrete number of muscles and how they change what we call the kinematics or joint motion of the joints that the muscles cross. In this case, muscles crossing the elbow and shoulder. And so we can look at range of motion and the effect of these different muscle parameters. We can collect data on participants in the lab, and then we can simulate them in these computational models. And here we have a more complex model, which shows muscles across different locations. Here, Johannes is using the model to simulate different motions. And what this allows us to do is predict how the muscles not only affect this motion, but how the forces then are transferred through the joint, and how those forces transferred through the joint might change things like this underlying architecture of bone and the other tissue mechanical properties. Thank you guys so much for coming on the tour with us today. We've had a great opportunity to see all the experimental testing, the computational modeling, and the image processing that we do here in the lab related to arthritis research. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to be part of our lab. But now get out of here. We have some more research to do. But seriously, that software for analyzing osteoarthritis progression, donor funded. Those brilliant students pushing boundaries on new detection methods, you made that possible. You're not just supporting research, you're literally changing how we treat the disease, and one day we'll hopefully find the cure. I really appreciate your support.